Welcome to Heian Haven. I'm Dawn. Today we're discussing Chapter 18 of the Tale of Genji, Matsukaze, Wind in the Pines. We'll start with our usual summary for shared context. Genji's eastern pavilion is completed, and he moves Hanachiru Sato, the lady at the Villa of Falling Flowers, into the west wing. The east wing is reserved for the Akashi lady, who Genji corresponds with constantly, urging her to come to the capital. The novice, the Akashi lady's father, recalls a family property and summons the caretaker, convincing him to repair the villa. He plans to move his daughter to Oi, on the outskirts of the city, to ease her transition to court life. Once work at Oi is complete, Genji sends retainers to fetch the Akashi lady and his daughter. With much sadness, the novice says goodbye to the nun, his wife, his daughter, and his granddaughter. The group goes by boat to Oi. The party was received by more of Genji's retainers, but he did not come. The lady comforted herself by playing the koto Genji left with her. Eventually, Genji tells Murasaki that he needs to visit a villa he's constructing in Katsura. She suspects the Akashi lady is involved. Finally arriving at Oi, dressed in dazzling court robes, Genji meets his enchanting daughter and spends the night with the Akashi lady. The next day, after conversing with the nun, Genji leaves for his temple to make arrangements for ceremonies to be performed and leaves instructions on the furnishings. With everything situated, he heads back to Oi. He and the lady play the koto, and Genji spends time with their daughter. The next day, retainers had begun to arrive at his Katsura villa and at Oi. The group made their way to Katsura and spent the day drinking and entertaining themselves with poetry. After becoming quite drunk, it is decided to spend the night in musical entertainment. A messenger arrives from the emperor, asking after Genji, who sends a reply back. The party then continued with more wine, music, and poetry. The next morning, Genji gives gifts of women's robes to everyone according to their rank and sets off for Nijo. After a rest, he tells Murasaki about Oi, the lady, and his daughter, and asks her to consider raising the child as her own. And for a little more context, Oi and Katsura are the same place. Both are names for the river that Waley says runs near Saga, to the east of Kyoto, where Genji was building a hermitage. Modern Kyoto is of course Heian, the capital, and the villa or hermitage or temple are also all one thing that Genji is building. With Chapter 18, we again have title translations that are nearly identical. Typically the title is a reference to a poem within the chapter. While Wind in the Pines is no different, and I like that it's not just a reference to a poem, but also the actual wind in the pines, the sound that mingles with the lady's koto playing as she waited for Genji, and the way that sound made everyone think of the same sound in Akashi. There's something about no longer having Suematsu's voice that made the experience of reading the translations a little different this time. I also was able to listen to Washburn's version a ridiculous number of times, so his voice is loudest to me for this chapter. Let's discuss our translation differences. When the novice summoned the caretaker of the Oi villa, he convinced him to move forward with the repairs. Waley doesn't mention gifts, but Washburn says the novice provided lavish gifts. Tyler says a great quantity of supplies arrived. Seidensticker says the recompense was ample. The caretaker was definitely taken care of. It also varies a little bit between the translators, but once Genji found out about Oi, he seems to have had a gallery built and provided all of the interior furnishings. Now for a more substantive discrepancy. Waley and Seidensticker say that Genji wrote a note to Murasaki to explain his trip to Katsura. Tyler and Washburn have the scene played out in dialogue, in person. And speaking of dialogue, our three later translators all have a certain retainer of Genji's speak to one of the Akashi lady's gentlewomen, hoping to rekindle a relationship begun during exile. But Waley translates the scene differently, as the guardsman approaches a gentlewoman hoping to get a message to her mistress, who there may have been a relationship with. I doubt his version very much. Let's pick on Waley a little more. When describing the revelry at Katsura, he describes a winding stream party, a Kyosui no En. This is an old Chinese game of sorts. There is a winding stream in which a cup of sake is floated. Participants are seated at various spots around the winding stream and must compose a poem before the cup reaches them. The person then drinks the cup in celebration or defeat. None of the other translators mention this, even in a footnote, only saying they composed poetry. Next is the description of the age of Genji's daughter. Seidensticker, Tyler, and Washburn all say that she is the same age as the leech child. Waley simply says 3 years old. The last discrepancies between Waley and the others we'll touch on when we discuss clothing. I imagine this will be a usual occurrence, as I object to the way he translated garment names on the grounds that it's wholly inaccurate, but I take issue with the way all the translators handled garment names. I mentioned in an earlier episode that I've become accustomed to the minor differences, such as what an instrument is called. This chapter provides a perfect example. Genji left a stringed instrument with the Akashi lady as a keepsake. Waley calls it a zithern, Seidensticker says Chinese koto, Tyler calls it a keen, and Washburn goes with 7-string koto. With all of those together, and the tiniest bit of digging, it becomes rather obvious to me that the instrument would likely be better called a guzheng. The guzheng is an ancient Chinese zither instrument introduced to Japan sometime between the 7th and 8th centuries, and it is an ancestor of the modern koto. One variation of it had 7 strings. All of our translators are right, but they potentially could have been more specific. The main thrust of this chapter happens in autumn, and we have a handful of the expected descriptors. There are comments about the colors in the country being further along and thus better than the leaves in the city. Seidensticker describes it as always the melancholy season. Tyler translates it as all things seem to weigh upon the heart, and Washburn provides when sensitivity to the poignant passing of time is at its height. All three describe busy autumn insects crying out. Washburn also describes the Akashi lady's grief as intensified by the loneliness of the season. Because we seem to have a large amount of the tale taking place in autumn, it has become rather obvious that Murasaki Shikibu was purposefully pulling the melancholy of the season into the tale. Once again, we run into a custom around departures. When the day has finally come for the Akashi lady to leave for the capital, her father, the novice, and mother, the nun, both shed tears, and we are reminded that it is bad luck to cry or even speak unhappily on such an occasion. We've already spoken of gifts when discussing the caretaker, but there are a few other mentions in this chapter. After the messengers arrive from the palace, Genji sends to Oi for something appropriate to use as gifts, as he has nothing at Katsura. 2 chests of women's robes are sent over. Genji places a full set of women's robes on the left shoulder of the royal envoy, who hurries back to the palace. Everyone else, all the retainers who were drinking and partying, were given gifts in accordance with their rank in the next morning. Then, a courtier, or perhaps a small group of courtiers, the translations vary, perform the saibara, my pony, and are rewarded with robes from the other retainers. And this is where we have the last translation difference of Waley. He says that the courtiers were presented with scarves that they wore on their heads, and those were what was presented to the performers. Poppycock. Another instance of Waley misinterpreting outer garment for scarf. Our other translators are much more correct in calling the garments dresses, gowns, and robes. We're reminded, when Genji shows up to Oi, that the lady had known Genji when he was thin, dressed in modest or plain hunting robes. These were the simple garments that Genji wore when stripped of rank in exile. But on this day, he took special care in selecting his outfit and was dazzling in his formal court robes. A bit later, Genji is in the garden dressed casually without his outer garment. Waley calls it being in his shirt sleeves, Seidensticker undersleeves. Tyler says he's in his gown, specifically in uchiki, which he names as the next layer down. My favorite source says the next layer down would be the hanpi, but as this garment was frequently not worn as it can't really be seen, Genji's next layer down would be the akome or hitoe. I've provided links in the description down below to my favorite resource for men's outfits and garments. And an interesting aside, when Genji discovers the nun has come to Oi with her daughter, he exclaims that he is not dressed properly and sends for his outer robe, a hoeki-noho. The nun's presence required formal dress, and Genji had inadvertently been a bit rude by being in his shirt sleeves. This chapter was filled with poetry and poetic references, and I'm excited to share some of that with you in the next Waka Wednesday episodes. What stood out for you in this chapter? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Join me next time for Chapter 19, Usugumo. Subscribe if you'd like to explore the Heian period of Japan with me through the tale of Genji.